Hi everyone, I'm Ian. When it comes to selling a lot of consoles, you'd think one of the best ways would be to release a solid console with lots of support for it. Or you could make small revisions to the existing console and trick users into thinking it's a new console. But really isn't.
Game console revisions, an easy way to make a quick buck for huge console developers. Console revisions aren't a new thing. It's not something that Microsoft and Sony came up with to sell more Xbox 360s and PS3s. It's actually something that developers have been doing for years. I'm not going to talk about everything from Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony, and Sega, just some of the highlights, but there's still quite a few of those. Nintendo was pretty much one of the first companies to do console revisions, and they always made it easy. The NES and SNES each got a revision, each called the New Style NES and New Style SNES, respectively. Now the N64 is the first of the really interesting revisions that I found. It didn't get a revision in the US or Japan, but instead in China. Somewhere in 2000, China banned video game consoles. Sounds like hell. So Nintendo released the iQ Player, a handheld N64. Kind of. The iQ Player is a fully self-contained N64, with 14 games that came preloaded. But because of some loopholes, it was able to be sold in China. The GameCube also had an interesting revision. Only sold in Japan was the Panasonic Cube, which is a combination between the GameCube and a Panasonic DVD player. It was actually released before the original Xbox, making it the first home console that would also play DVDs. Too bad it wasn't released in the US. Sony also had some interesting revisions with the PS2. There was obviously the original PS2, also known as the Fat PS2, and there was the revision called the PS2 Slim. But there were actually two more revisions of the PS2, the first of which was the PSX, which was exclusively released in Japan.
Damn it!
The PSX was a Sony digital video recorder with a built-in PS2. It was actually designed to be a general-purpose consumer device, and it was also marketed by Sony Corporation instead of Sony Computer Entertainment. It did actually sell out during its first week on the market, but after this, due to the high price, it had poor sales later on. Now, with Sega is where this stuff gets really interesting.
Trust me on this.
You'd think that the Sega Master System would be Sega's all-new console.
You would be so wrong.
The Master System is actually a revision of a revision of a revision, the first of which being the Sega SG-1000. Really rolls off the tongue. The SG-1000 was Sega's first home console and was actually released on the same day as the Nintendo Famicom. This is not where it ends. The SG-1000 was revised into the SG-1002, or the SC-3000, which was a computer version of the same console. Still doesn't end here. The SG-1002 was then revised to be the Sega Mark III, which was then revised once again to become the Master System. Wow. The Master System isn't where the confusion ends with Sega. Oh no. Sega's very next console is even more confusing, the Sega Genesis. Now, there was the original Genesis, known as the Model 1. The only revision for this one was the Genesis Model 2, which is where things get really confusing. Around when the Genesis Model 2 came out is also when the Sega CD and 32X add-ons came out. Now, completely ignoring the 32X, the Genesis Model 2 and Sega CD were later repackaged as a single console called the Genesis CDX. After the CDX, Sega wanted an easier way to get their console to more people. So, Sega partnered with JVC to create the Wonder Mega, which was only released in Japan. But it had its own revision called the Wonder Mega 2, also known as the JVC XI here in the US. Sega also partnered with Pioneer, yes, the people who mainly make audio equipment, to make the Laser Active, which was a Genesis CDX that could also play Laserdiscs and music CDs. Several companies also added the Mega Drive, which is the European version of the Genesis, to personal computers, which Sega also did with the Terra Drive. Some of these other companies are MSX, with the AS330 and AX990 only distributed in Kuwait and Yemen, but Amstrad also made the Mega PC, which were distributed in Europe and Australia. When Sega discontinued the Genesis Model 2, Majesco Entertainment stepped in and developed the Genesis Model 3, a smaller, more budget-friendly version of the Genesis. While Majesco was making the Genesis Model 3, Eco Films, who distributed the Genesis in Portugal, created the Mega Game 2, a revision of the Mega Drive. It was also considered the best version of the Mega Drive, as it was able to play games from any region with the use of a region switch.
In recent years, console developers have been a lot more conservative on how many revisions they release, making it much easier to follow what to buy. Well, that was confusing, but it just goes to show, if you really want to, you can make someone's day worse.